Everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kevin Quigley. I'm the director of the MacEachen Institute for Public Policy and Governance. Thanks so much for joining us today. Today's panel is called Whose Nation? Navigating a New Era of Crown-Indigenous Relations. To open our discussion today, I'd like to introduce Jerry Mosco Leblanc. Ms. Leblanc is the coordinator of the Elders in Residence program here at Dalhousie. She's a member of the Nakawi Nation, Saskatchewan, and a member of the Bear Clan. She'll be performing the land acknowledgement and opening prayer for our event.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you all hear me? Good, great. I'm honored to open your series, your events today, and I'm going to say a prayer. But when I say a prayer, when I pray to the Creator, my Creator. I invite you to talk to who it is you talk to when you pray. But before I say my prayer, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded and unsurrendered land of the Mi'kmaq. Unceded means when the Mi'kmaq signed the treaties in 1725 and two more later, they did not cede land or resources. They were simply peace and friendship treaties that showed the newcomers how to survive when they arrived here. And yesterday, of course, was Mi'kmaq Treaty Day. And that doesn't mean it's Treaty Day for all nations across Canada. It's simply Mi'kmaq Treaty Day. And of course, it is Mi'kmaq History Month this month. So I'm really pleased that you're all going to be talking about Indigenous issues, technology and traditional values. So I invite you all to stand, please. And if the gentlemen could remove their headgear. As I said, I pray to my Creator. I invite you to pray to who it is you talk to when you pray. Great Spirit and good Creator of all things, we honor you with this prayer. We are the descendants of the many peoples you so long ago chose to live in harmony on Turtle Island. We give thanks for allowing us all to gather here today. Good Creator, more than ever, we need your strength, guidance, and truth. Give us the ability to recognize and use the gifts and teachings you have provided. Help us pass the virtues of respect and sharing to others. We direct our attention to the life forces on Mother Earth. She has given birth to all animal creatures and to all plants that nourish us. For this we give thanks. We ask that you help those who are experiencing difficulty and conflict in their lives find peace and comfort. We pray for our Mother Earth so that she may recover from the many sores we have inflicted upon her. We pray for the good of our nations, our communities, our families, our elders, our leaders, our teachers, and our medicine people. Creator, we humbly ask for your help so that the treaties between nations be respected, protected, and honored, as they were intended for as long as the sun shines, the rivers flow, and the grass grows. Gitchiminitu, we promise to work together so that all steps we take will become the path of peace for future generations. Tahoe. Thank you.
Thanks so much to Elder Mosco Leblanc. It's now my pleasure to introduce John Paul. Mr. Paul is the Executive Director of the Atlantic Policy Congress of First Nations Chiefs Secretariat in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. Taking direction from the Atlantic Chiefs through frequent All-Chiefs forums and Executive Chiefs meetings, Mr. Paul provides policy analysis and strategic advice on a wide range of issues facing First Nations in Atlantic Canada and Eastern Quebec. Mr. Paul has a Bachelor of Arts in Community Studies from Cape Breton University in 1980 and received his Master of Public Administration in Financial Management, pleased to hear it, from none other than Dalhousie University in 1982. John Paul.
Well, I was thinking about what to talk about today, and I didn't want to make it too complicated today, but I think the way I look at this stuff is the new government, the Liberals, I call them the recreated Liberal government, is back with a new leader, and a lot of the things that are coming out of what they're doing and what they're saying has originated in the platform that the party put forth. That is an essential part of what they're doing is executing their platform. The issue becomes is how do you implement these new things which create a lot of challenges to the system, to the courts, to just Joe Blow general public, basically, about some of the things that they're talking about fundamentally changing. You know, how many people actually talk about or know United Nations UNDRIP? You know, you think about that. How many people actually know about that? You know, because it's become a prevalent thing in our communities. More and more of our communities try to understand it from a perspective that as a world we have to take care of creation and the environment and build a better future. And I think that's one of the fundamental beliefs that our communities have is building a future based on who we are. That is with our language, our culture, the legacy of the residential schools. All those things are part of who we are and need to be part of whatever it is we come up with in the future. And I think that the government and the politicians are really having a hard time trying to connect what they really want to do in their heart and what their head tells them to do as a political imperative, basically, and try to reconcile this stuff. And, you know, you have our new ministers, you know, one that's about the future, which is Carolyn Bennett. She's really focused on the future and the relationship in the future. Jane Philippot is focused on how do we take what's currently going on in the government and let Indigenous people run those things, basically. That's fundamentally what they're trying to do. The issue is they're having to deal with 8,000 bureaucrats in both CERNA and Indigenous Service. There's 8,000 civil servants working there on this stuff full time. So I always tell somebody when I'm home, I said, you guys got 8,000 people working for you all the time. I don't know if they're working for us, working against us. So it really is important what they do and what they say. And most recently, the focus has been on, in the last couple of weeks, has been on, the big thing is a new relationship. And I really believe that in what the PM says and what the ministers say and even what is in the different mandate letters for all the ministers, not just the two that are charged with our responsibilities, but all the other ministers have similar wording in there about the important relation they should have with Indigenous people. And we reemphasize that every time we talk to the MPs, either regionally, locally. And I reminded the chiefs last week, you have to continue to remind them because they're going to get busy with all the other stuff going on. I said, so you continually have to remind them. One of the things that most recently that's come up is recognition and implementation of our rights legislation. And it's didn't come out yet, but it's a proposed piece of legislation. And in Ottawa, we were in Ottawa a couple of weeks ago with a couple hundred chiefs and a lot of our legal advisors and people that have been around 30, 40 years in this business talking about what are the implications of entrenching what they're talking about into legislation. And I was talking to the people talking about how it must be connected to UNDRIP, how it must be connected to what's going on with the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, how it's got to tie to reform for Indigenous control. They've got to somehow be connected in there. And it's really, how do we go about empowering our people, our leadership, and our communities to really figure that out? There is a concern that I do have about what they're talking about. And the concern is, almost in the year 2000, almost 18 years ago, the Liberal government introduced a policy called Canada's Approach to the Implementation of the Inherent Right and Negotiation of Self-Government. In 1980, it's a framework document, a skeletal document, and what I explained to people, in the 20 years hence, it now has a body, legs, a mind, fingers, everything, because they filled this policy around what they thought the federal interests were. And the other big thing is that in looking at that, if they entrench what they're talking about, I still, even with this policy, it wasn't necessarily supported or accepted by the provinces at the time. And neither is this new legislation. It's a hard slog with the provinces trying to get them to agree to this stuff. And because the provinces have a very big role with our communities and with what goes on in each province, and the policy itself and the legislation they're talking about has to be connected to these things, because if they operate in isolation, I don't know if they'll actually make the kind of difference that people are trying to make, because it's got to be integrated into all these things. A friend of mine works in the government, works in some senior policy thingy or whatever I tell him, and he's working on, I don't know if you guys saw these. These are 10 principles that came out last summer by the Minister of Justice. And I spoke to her and their chief of staff about these principles the day they were announced in Ottawa. I actually ended up at a meeting with both of them that day. And I asked her, so what are you guys trying to do with this? And she says, we're trying to articulate the best way we can what it is and where we want to go. And I told her, I said, and then they met with legal scholars from across the country to talk about it. They had different concerns and different issues about it. But I said, at least I know that your mind forward is trying to put the best foot forward here. It's not based on the colonial doctrine and just keep on plowing us back into the ocean kind of thing. And I always tell people, I'm not going, you guys aren't going anywhere, and we're not going anywhere. So we're going to have to coexist, and coexistence and creating and supporting the type of self-government and governments that we're going to create has to coexist and has to work with provinces. It has to work within the legal framework of the government. But I always explain to my own chief and other chiefs, it's got to work for communities to improve the lives of our communities. Because in spite of all the fanfare of investments and money and all this stuff, you still see people in Indigenous community with serious problems of housing. Child services is still an issue. Education, all these things, a lot of these things are still issues. And access to natural resources or resource revenue sharing, big issues. And I think that those are things that I hope will get worked out a little better before it all gets sorted out. I think we're supposed to know within a few months whether they'll announce a new legislation. And I told them, I said, I don't know if you guys got enough time, because you only have a year left in the legislative window, and you're already trying to get the UNDRIP legislation through. You're trying to implement this whole new way of thinking. Over 250,000 civil servants in the government. Not an easy undertaking. But the good part about it is that one of the probably the most important and interesting things that I've seen is I've actually been in a meeting with Marneau and Perry, talking about the federal budget and talking about why these investments are so important to close the gap. Because we can't be in your reality if we're still worried about something else. Poor housing, poor water. Like, how can you worry about the good life if you're still stuck in the mud trying to deal with other things? So just last week, they saw him and told him the same thing. Stay the course. Invest in the things that will improve conditions and close the gap. Our communities are moving slow but sure on self-government. They are moving on economic opportunities and growth. And I always use the line, 2 years ago I did a study in Atlantic Canada. We contribute $1.15 billion to the Atlantic economy. And that number, 2 years later, I figure it's about $1.5 billion now in terms of how much we contribute to the economy. And I said, you know, just make us part of all this stuff. And I think that you'll benefit just as much. I said, you know, if we get out of poverty and get a better life, I think that you will contribute more. So, you know, with that, I'll leave it open and give my other colleagues time to speak. And I know they gave me a clock and told me I had a clock on my hand. So I try to stick to it, you know. So with that, thanks.
Tari, were you flashing those cards? Yes, oh, he was. Okay, that was it. Right. Okay.
Close. See, I saw you there. I saw the sign there, right? I said, oh, he's going to put up the sign.
Cheryl Simon. Cheryl is a proud Mi'kmaq woman from Epiquet with extensive experience in community-based policy development. She completed her BA in Native Studies from the University of Lethbridge and her LLB from the University of Victoria. She also studied Maori law and comparative Indigenous studies in New Zealand. After briefly practicing law, Cheryl worked as a manager of governance advisory services with a national organization. She worked with First Nations communities across the country, assisting in developing governance models based on traditional systems. She is currently policy and operations manager for Mi'kmaq Dabludan, a treaty rights implementation organization. She's completing her Master's of Law at York, and she lives with her husband and her 2 children in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. Cheryl.
So, Kwe, Amchidida, Deluisa Cheryl Simon, and Ebikwet Nwach. So, my name is Cheryl Simon. I'm from Ebikwet, which is the Mi'kmaq name for what you would refer to as Prince Edward Island. And my grandmother is Mary Jane Jadis, and she was from Lennox Island, which is a Mi'kmaq community off the coast of the northern part of PEI. My grandfather was from the Kentville area, but due to centralization, his band was Shubenacadie. So he moved to PEI, met my grandmother, and she was not able to last long off the island. So the family is now located in PEI. So the reason why I'm telling you this is because that follows a traditional protocol within the Mi'kmaq as to who I am, who my family is, and what my territory is. And the distinction and the differences between that is what I'm going to talk about today with my presentation. Because I want to address the policy decisions that are going into this new relationship and what has changed from the government perspective and from the Mi'kmaq perspective. Because from the government perspective, I think that's where the greatest shift has been. That's where the claim to being a new relationship, like a new era of self-governance, that has actually never changed for Ulnuk. The government's reluctance to meet with us, to recognize our rights, to engage with us at a top level, that is new, not the Ulnuk insistence that they do so. That goes back centuries, right? And you may have noticed that I slipped into Ulnuk. And we're going to talk a little bit about the language and the word usage that we use because it's really critical to policy and to policy implementation. Because Ulnuk is the name that we have for ourselves, and it translates roughly to the people. So if we're referring to myself, I'm Ulnuk, we are Ulnuk, our territory is Ulnumagi, the land of the people. If I'm speaking about other Indigenous peoples, whether they be Cree, Anishinaabe, Blackfoot, I still refer to them as Ulnuk because it's a recognition that I have that they are Indigenous to the territory in which they are. So these things, these concepts, is the starting point for our policy relationship with the Crown. So the shift is, again, is perception, right? Because we've been steadfast in that, and you can't identify yourself as being Ulnuk from Ulnumagi without recognizing the fact that my distinct identity comes from thousands of years of being on this territory. It's how our language developed, our culture developed. That is something that has been steadfast. Those exertions, recognition of that, we've always taken that position. So what do we do with government policy on the other hand? Because I think we've been aware that the government's relationship with First Nations has shifted, right? And we have a very recent history within Canada. So that concept of being Ulnuk has not been codified within the Canadian government. What the government has focused on is Indians, lands reserved for Indians, Indian reserves. And that is a policy decision, that is legislative definitions that have been enforced upon us. Right? But there's a shift, there's a difference between that. So those concepts of Indian status, which has also diverged into band membership, like you've heard of First Nations, right? And bands, Indian bands. There's membership available to those communities. Those concepts of Indians, Indian bands, and membership thereof, that is a policy decision that the Crown took for ease of administration, for fear of fiscal liability, for incremental responses to changes in the law. But it's only ever been based on ancestry. It's never been based on culture. So when we have this shift now, when we're talking about self-governance, how do we get from a legal, very formulaic definition of Indian to a full recognition of who I am and who we are within this country for Ulnuk? How does that happen? Right? So I think from the government's perspective, this shift has occurred because they are now coming to the table to talk with us about things that they never have before. But I think from a Mi'kmaq perspective, we are now able to be more demonstrative in illustrating to the Crown what it is that we are talking about, because we've been confined within the structures of the English language. Right? And those were just some of the examples. But I want to tell you how this difference between ancestry has played out. And the example I'm going to give you is myself, okay? Because I was born a non-Indian. I became an Indian when I was 8 years old. I was denied band membership when I came of age. When I reached my age of majority at 18, I was out in Alberta at the time. I was granted, when I had children with a non-native partner, I was eligible to become a full Indian as opposed to a half Indian. And I only just was granted band membership last year when I was 39 years old. Okay? That has nothing to do with who I am as Ulnuk, because Ulnuk has been steadfast all the way up through there. My grandmother was Ulnuk, my mother is Ulnuk, my children are Ulnuk, my cousins, my family. So these concepts of family relationships, how do they get addressed within that dichotomy, right? Ancestry versus culture. And I think what we have a lot of problems now with the government is that they are still focused on trying to fix the problems with focusing on ancestry, couched in cultural language, but it's not fitting, right? There's a disconnect there. And when I'm talking about the differences between ancestry and culture, is the limitations in just looking at descendancy. See, the treaties refer to the Mi'kmaq tribe and their heirs forever, right? You hear descendants is used a lot. But when we are speaking as Mi'kmaq people, as Ulnuk people, we have a different scope, a different definition for that. And I'll use the word unclemoxis, which means uncle, right? So in English, uncle is somebody that has, the sibling of your parent, right? That's uncle. But in the Mi'kmaq sense, it's talking about somebody who looks out for you, who has a role and a relationship with you, right? And that's different than just the biology. But the problem is when we talk with the Crown about needing to rectify the problems with the Indian Act because we want to focus on families, we're still using words that they interpret differently, right? And so the problem is that there's always been an assumption and that our system is not going to work, right? That it's too expansive. But the problem is that they're looking at as culture and family as something that, it can get rapidly out of hand. And they've had a couple of examples when they tried to do a descendancy formula, and it got a lot bigger than they were intending. But the problem is that they forgot the cultural component of family. What is it that we are talking about in terms of relationship with land, relationship with each other? That is what we need to be considering, right? So when we look at that, the government's focus these days has been on how do we fix the problems of the Indian status definitions. That is what the policy discussion has been in this country. Right? I don't know if you are familiar with the issues with the Senate, and there's been a lot of 6-1A all the way, and there's been a lot of movement, a lot of protest with it. But the interesting thing is that I find is that the policy question is still couched in that. How do we deal with codifying these families? When I believe, as an Ulnuk, that the question is wrong, it should be, should we be codifying family? Should we be making that attempt? Should Parliament be the ones who are attempting to codify Indigenous families? Because if the answer is no, then why are we wasting time and resources on that problem, on that policy discussion, right? And there's examples that we have even within the Commonwealth of places where they have not codified or legally formally defined people. For instance, Maori. The Maori definition is descendants of the Maori race, right? It's much more broad, but it's up to the iwis and the tribes to talk about, and to accept people, right, as their family. So if we're talking about a shift to self-governance, and we're talking about dealing with this issue of defining Indians and administrative concerns, we need to actually be looking at who are the ones that have the familial knowledge to address that problem. Because I'm not sure why we keep thinking that it's Parliament. Right? And this has repercussions for the provinces as well, because the provinces are also faced with that dilemma of dealing with the federal construct of Indians, and when they're dealing with the communities that live within their jurisdiction. And, well, I won't get into their exertions of jurisdiction, but it's there. But I think that this new era, we have to take a look at the differences in language. We have to take a look at these policy discussions. Because I don't know how many people are aware that we've actually only been living in this country with a defined Indian under the Indian Act for 66 years. That is an extremely short period of time. Even with, if you want to use since the time of Confederation, that's 85 years that we did not have a formulaic definition of Indian. Right? And if you want to look at it from an Ulnuk perspective, we've had 15,000 years where we weren't defining that. So again, that policy question, should we be trying to fix the problems? And I'm not saying that the legacy of those definitions shouldn't be addressed, because I think that the people who were denied status and were stripped from the right to be in their communities contributed to things like the murdered and missing inquiry people that we're talking about. What happened with people that were forced off and out of their communities and out of their families, right? What happens when people's sense of identity gets tied up with having a card? Right? That legacy needs to be dealt with. But I think that the focus has been on the wrong policy question. We should be talking about empowering nations to be dealing with those cultural components, because we are the ones that have the expertise in that, right? And when I'm talking about being more demonstrative about it, I think that we are, in Mi'kmaq and Ulnuk, we have a very verb-based language, right? Like everything is about relationships and action. And so when we're talking about self-governance, Aboriginal and treaty rights, we need to actually be showing people what it is that we're talking about. Because if I take you out to the woods to talk about Mi'kmaq quill work, and I told Dr. Walden it always comes back to quill work with me, it's a harvesting, it's an art form. And if I'm standing in front of a tree that I know that probably 50 years ago, one of my ancestors stood in that spot and harvested from that tree and used that bark for the same purpose that I'm going to be using and teaching to my children, that is not going to be easily codified, nor should it. Right? So again, I guess I'm starting to run out of time. I've got the signs coming up. But just what policy questions are we trying to use and answer when we're dealing with these problems? Thank you.
Thanks so much. Now to Dr. Ingrid Waldron. Dr. Waldron is an associate professor in the School of Nursing at Dalhousie. Her research is focused on the impacts of discrimination on health in Black, Indigenous, and immigrant communities. She's particularly interested in the impacts of gentrification and environmental racism in the Black community in North End of Halifax and Indigenous communities across Nova Scotia. Dr. Waldron's Enrich project is investigating the social, economic, political, and health effects of environmental racism in African, Nova Scotian, and Mi'kmaq communities. Dr. Waldron is hosting the Halifax launch of her book tomorrow at the Halifax City Library, and we encourage everyone to attend that. Her new book, There's Something in the Water, Environmental Racism in Indigenous and Black Communities, it's an outstanding read. I strongly encourage everyone to pick up a copy, perhaps several copies. But a very thoughtful and powerful analysis, and as I mentioned to Ingrid in the green room, it was a remarkably productive sabbatical year for her last year. I'm sure she made a lot of headway in writing it, but it's a very accessible book, but a very powerful account of important issues. So we're really delighted that she's here today, and thanks so much, and congratulations on the book.
So in this presentation, I'd like to do the following. I want to discuss some of the main concerns that Mi'kmaq communities have around environmental policy, highlight some of the challenges in addressing environmental concerns in Mi'kmaq communities through environmental policies, and discuss environmental policy and legislation issues that need to be focused on during the next federal elections. I would like to begin by noting that studies conducted over the last several years in Nova Scotia and Canada have shown that Indigenous communities are more likely than other communities to be located near industry that have harmful health effects, an issue that is often referred to as environmental racism. So what is environmental racism? It's racial discrimination in environmental policymaking, in the greater exposure of non-white or racialized communities to toxic waste disposal and the siting of polluting industries, and in the implementation of policies that sanction the harmful and in many cases life-threatening poisons in these communities. It's important to contextualize environmental racism within long-standing forms of oppression resulting from colonialism and government policies seeking to eradicate or assimilate Indigenous peoples. The impacts of colonization manifest in federal and provincial government failure to acknowledge its responsibilities to address land management and environmental protection issues in Indigenous communities, despite the fact that it has a legal duty to do so under the Indian Act. The flip side of environmental racism is, of course, environmental justice, and environmental justice should encompass the tools, strategies, and policies focused on eliminating unfair, unjust, and inequitable conditions and decisions that contribute to and produce differential exposure to environmental harms and result in unequal protection. A sound environmental justice framework should focus on procedural equities, which makes explicit the extent to which rules, regulations, evaluation criteria, and enforcement are applied fairly, uniformly, and in a non-discriminatory way in all communities. One of the most significant challenges or barriers to addressing environmental concerns in Mi'kmaq communities pertains to the ways in which environmental policy creates, upholds, and sustains inequities in the spatial patterning of polluting industries and in the consultation process. We can conceptualize environmental racism as having two main components: distributive, spatial injustice, and procedural injustice. Distributive spatial injustice can be defined as the inequitable distribution or spatial patterning of environmental burdens or risks. Procedural injustice, on the other hand, refers to inequitable and non-inclusive consultation and decision-making processes related to the siting of industry, as well as unfair toxic waste management, regulatory practices, evaluation criteria, and enforcement. An environmental assessment, or an EA, is one example of a procedural process that many Mi'kmaq communities believe continues to be unjust. An environmental assessment is a tool through which environmental effects of a proposed project or undertaking are predicted and evaluated, and a subsequent decision is made on the acceptability of the project or undertaking. The purpose of an EA is to promote sustainable development by protecting and conserving the environment. EA promotes better project planning by identifying and assessing possible adverse effects on the environment before a new undertaking begins. This is accomplished by involving government agencies, NGOs, First Nations, and the general public throughout the review process of this proposed development. The importance of consultation and collaboration with Indigenous communities stems from obligations and treaty rights under Section 35 of the Constitution Act. The Peace and Friendship Treaty, as well as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, that's UNDRIP, affirm Mi'kmaq title to their territory, which also supports the government's obligation to consult with the Mi'kmaq Nation before the development on their territories. And while the federal government in Canada has a fiduciary duty to consult First Nations regarding industrial projects affecting their territory, this is not interpreted as a duty to attain consent. There have been several cases in Nova Scotia where the procedural process for Mi'kmaq communities has not been inclusive and where the public consultation process has been limited. For example, you probably all heard about the Alton Gas Project. In the fall of 2014, Alton Gas began developing a brine discharge pipeline, but halted the project as local resistance grew. Throughout 2016, resistance to the Alton Gas Project grew even stronger, with Sibonagady and Millbrook nations arguing that they were not adequately consulted, that they had never given consent for the project to resume, that they were not given enough time to review the project, and environmental impact assessments, and that they were provided with little to no notice about public meetings where they could express their concerns about the project before it resumed. Canadian colonial history has influenced methods of environmental legislation and planning in Canada. These methods, however, continue to be culture blind, non-inclusive, reflect political supremacy, and show apathy towards environmental concerns in Mi'kmaq and other Indigenous communities. Therefore, it's important that the government begin to consider, in a more forceful way, policy openings for the implementation of the concept of free, prior, and informed consent. I'd like to briefly outline a few environmental policy issues that I believe require attention in the next federal election. First, any environmental legislation concerned with the needs, priorities, and rights of Indigenous communities should put in place built-in mechanisms to ensure that there are community-defined best practices around the siting of facilities. Environmental legislation must speak to the priorities of Indigenous peoples, recognize Indigenous treaty rights, consider how the ongoing environmental assessment process can be done in collaboration with affected communities, and identify gaps in existing policies related to citizen engagement, community consultations, and other decision-making processes related to the location, monitoring, regulation, evaluation, and remediation of facilities and other environmental hazards. Culturally relevant participatory democracy is an important approach for addressing ways of knowing in Indigenous communities and engaging these communities in environmental injustices that impact their communities. If conducted in a culturally relevant way, it can provide Indigenous communities with more opportunities and avenues for meaningful public participation and public consultation in decision-making processes. In other words, it can ensure that the people most affected by these decisions are involved early on and throughout the process. The second issue that I believe that needs to be considered in the next federal election is the importance of incorporating a health equity impact assessment in the environmental assessment and approval process, an issue that's often not discussed, but because I'm a health researcher, I consider this to be one of the most important issues. This should acknowledge acknowledge how projects disproportionately impact Indigenous communities who are already experiencing vulnerability, more vulnerability than other communities in Canada, with respect to various structural determinants of health. These are income inequality and poverty, unemployment and underemployment, food insecurity, and other structural determinants of health. A health equity impact assessment can be used to support improved health equity through the reduction of avoidable health disparities between different communities. It's a tool to support decisions which walks users through the steps for identifying how a program or policy will impact communities in different ways. The end goal is to maximize the positive impacts and reduce the negative impacts that could potentially widen health disparities between communities. In short, it supports more equitable policies that would have impacts on health and well-being. In conclusion, environmental policy has traditionally had a singular focus on pollutants. ignoring the social and economic inequalities that may render Indigenous communities more vulnerable to the synergistic effects of social and environmental stressors on their health. Therefore, what is needed is a framework within the environmental assessment process that considers the cumulative health and mental health impacts of industry in Indigenous communities. Is that 12 minutes?
You've got plenty of time, so.
Oh, well, I shouldn't have rushed.
We will do our best to fill up the time. I don't think you should worry about it. Thank you so much. Okay, so as is our custom, we're going to pivot and ask 5 students today to ask their pre-prepared questions, and then we'll move from there and we'll open it up to the floor for questions from the community in the class. So we will start with Mikla Bartlett.
Hi, my name is Makayla. I'm a first-year MPA student, so my question is for John Paul. The Assembly of First Nations recently passed a resolution calling for a halt to the Indigenous rights framework. With that in mind, Crown-Indigenous relations and the government continue to conduct consultations and negotiations with First Nations. How can First Nations ensure that they have the necessary legal policy resources without having to rely on Crown-Indigenous relations funding? Thank you.
I'll give you the quick answer to that, because that was the discussion at this meeting I went to in Ottawa 2 weeks ago, and basically the directions and discussions from pretty well across the country, it wasn't just one part of the country, but all the parts of the country, basically told the minister, Bennett, slow down, listen to drafting instructions that were provided to you a month ago by a legal consortium in British Columbia, as well as ensure the connection to the UNDRUP legislation that's currently in the House, but also do it at a pace of our communities. Don't try to do something and for the sake of doing it, basically. And really that was a resounding message about it. And we were with Perry Bellegarde last week here in Halifax, and that's one of the questions that came up, and chiefs expressed their concern, and he said, well, we're going to do it at a pace that works for us. The government can do what they're going to do, and the groups have already expressed their willingness and ability to resist, which we're good at that. I always tell people we're good at that kind of stuff, and see if they actually listen, because it goes back to the point that they keep harping on, that we're actually going to listen. Unless you listen and actually do something with what you're being told, then is it really true? Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's just like somebody tells you the car is blue, and they keep talking to all the other people that tell you the car is red, and it's still green. And so until it can work for communities themselves, it just can't work at a big political level. It's got to work with communities, you know.
Claire.
Hi, I'm Claire. I'm also a first-year MPA student. My question is for Ms. Simon. I'm from BC, where we're seeing increased consultation with Indigenous communities, particularly relating to environmental impacts. Trans Mountain Pipeline comes to mind. I have noticed that the richer coastal nations tends to be the one more showcased in media, and their opinions often differ from the inland and northern Indigenous communities. How do you suggest more mobilization of these underrepresented communities?
I think a lot of it is going to come down to the government support of the actual governance requirements of First Nations, because we have a history in the country of funding Indian Act bans to meet objectives of the Crown, and instead, if they're talking about meeting their obligations with the nations, they need to start shifting their focus and their funding to make sure that the nations are capable of functioning. And we have a responsibility as well to supplement, to use our resources to meet our objectives, but where we're hindered by the lack of access to those resources, which brings you back to the Crown. So it seems to be almost like a catch-22. So for the First Nations that have more resources, they're able to have the technical resources they need to make assessments. They have the resources necessary to mobilize their community members, their leadership, their elders to get the knowledge and get their opinion out there in a way that it proves to be very effective. So I think that if the government is going to be serious about this new era of self-governance and representing the, but to recognize our rights, they need to understand that you need to have flexibility to meet on issues that are of Indigenous importance, and we need to be able to make sure that our objectives are being met with things like funding and whatnot. And so if there's gaps between the communities, that's what they need to be addressing, as opposed to being concerned about the deliverables with very specific consultation processes.
James.
Hi, my name's James. I'm a first-year MPA student here at Dowell. My question was for Dr. Waldron. So, along the lines of what we've already been talking about, but Prime Minister Trudeau promised in February 2018 to develop a new recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights framework. He plans to have his legislation passed before the 2019 election. However, some First Nation chiefs believe that the proposed framework is being rushed to meet this deadline. What challenges will this pose for the Indigenous community if the Liberal government fails to enact legislation before the 2019 election? And on the flip side, what problems could occur if the legislation is rushed without adequate consultation and input from Indigenous communities?
Well, it reflects a lot of what I said, that some of the main concerns that Indigenous communities have, and the main concern around environmental legislation, is failing to understand Indigenous worldviews and Indigenous timelines. So this could be another case where Indigenous communities are not consulted at the get-go and throughout the process. Another aspect of that is not using a lens that is culturally specific with respect to Indigenous communities. So the way in which environmental assessments are conducted and the way in which policies are developed are very Euro-Western, and not taking into account the very specific worldviews and understandings of the world of Indigenous peoples. So we know in general that Indigenous peoples and other communities have a lens that is premised on holism, on equilibrium, on a connection between the land, between animals, between human beings, and have a particular traditional ecological Indigenous model that they would like these processes to be embedded in. And the way it's being conducted, and the way it probably would continue to be conducted, is a rush process that is not inclusive of Indigenous communities, that is not acknowledging their ways of being, not acknowledging their ways of knowing, and will continue on within this Eurocentric or Euro-Western framework. The result on Indigenous communities, the impact, is that once again they will be left out of the process, and environmental racism and environmental racism will continue. I don't believe environmental racism will ever be addressed unless there is true and authentic and organic collaborations with Indigenous peoples, and I don't think the government is ready for that to happen. The risk of collaborating with Indigenous peoples is that there will be a demand that many of these projects halt, that they discontinue. And that has impacts for government because the ultimate goal of development is, of course, capitalism and profit. So the impact is that Indigenous communities will continue to suffer. They will continue to suffer economically, socially, environmentally, and in terms of their health. And as I mentioned earlier, these are communities that are experiencing existing vulnerabilities around housing and education and poverty and income insecurity and food insecurity. In terms of the continuum or the hierarchy in Canada, they are the bottom with respect to every single social indicator. So the risk for Indigenous peoples is this: if this continues to happen, and if environmental legislation is not accommodating in specific ways to Indigenous communities, these things will worsen. Education and their access to education would worsen. their health would worsen. The social instability within Indigenous communities, missing and murdered women is one aspect of that, will continue to worsen. So I look at it in terms of social well-being and health and indicators where they're already on the bottom of every single social indicator in Canada. There was an author who discussed the need to proceed with environmental assessments, but also to have an environmental assessment process that is a specifically Indigenous environmental assessment process, so that the traditional EA process can go ahead, but at the same time we have a uniquely Indigenous EA or environmental assessment process that is happening at the same time, but that is honoring and respecting Indigenous ecological knowledge. And he laid out, the benefits of that. So I think, just in conclusion, I don't have a lot of hope that the government is taking this issue seriously. I don't see it happening in the country, and I don't see it happening in Nova Scotia. The theme, when we look at the central issue throughout Canada, it's really around consultation. It's around lack of respect for Indigenous peoples. It's about a kind of fear or anxiety of abandoning a Euro-Western framework, because abandoning that means that Indigenous peoples and other communities of color will have more power. And it's the power that they want, or the self-governance, or it's a sense of self-empowerment that I think the broader community fears and has anxieties around. And for me, environmental racism is just a symptom of this fear of people having power within their communities. I hope that answered your question.
Hala Nader.
Hi. I'm going to ask this question to Dr. Waldron following what you just said. So in order to demand their rights and preserve their rights, should Indigenous groups and other marginalized communities be trying to engage with the settler government, institution, and courts that have historically discriminated against them and oppressed them, or should they turn away from state engagement and push back, relying more on traditional forms of resistance, such as protests and blockades? And
that's a great question. One of the things I argue in my book is that I think communities need to engage in an anti-authoritarian agenda, because when you're working with government, you're working within governmental structures that are often, as I said, not accommodating, for example, to Indigenous worldviews, Indigenous understandings of the world. When I began the Enrich Project, I was committed to working with government, and there was an activist on my team who was very much the activist, was extremely anti-government, and I've never understood that. To me, you work with everyone, and that was in 2012. So I used to be really sarcastic to him, and I would say to him, "I'm getting in bed with government," and he would look at me and say, "Oh yeah, really, Ingrid? That's nice." But I was saying to him that I think it's important to work with everyone. And as the project has continued over the years, that was in 2012, I now recognize what he was saying, and I now actually agree with him. When he came to me and said, "I would like you to take on the Enrich Project," he said, "I don't think anything will ever be done, and government will never do anything, but anyway, let's just do this anyhow." And I thought, God, how cynical. Because I tend to be naive. I'm a very open person, right? So I thought, this is so cynical. I don't know about you, but I'm going to be working with government. And here I am now in 2018, and I recognize that he was right, because I think of the challenges that I've had working with government. But then I look at the Alton Gas issue, and I look at leader Doreen Bernard, and I see what she has done up at the treaty camp, and I truly believe that the reason that the Alton Gas Project has been halted is everything to do with what she and other members of her community have done throughout the years. So when you talk about civil disobedience and protest, respectful protest, staking out at the treaty camp. Anybody who tries to get into the camp, they say, this is Mi'kmaq land, get off the land. When I see that on video or I read information in the news, I said, this is where it's at. It's really about civil disobedience and working outside of government, considering government, yes, but I think mainly resisting and community mobilizing and engaging the broader community, allies, if you will, is what I've seen has been working in the case of, I guess, Alton Gas specifically. So my opinion has changed. I still believe I should work with government to a certain extent, but I'm not placing all my, I'm not depending on government to do some of the things that I think should be done anymore. I'm actually now looking to community to set the stage for what they want to do and to mobilize their communities, and thinking about how my project can support those communities either physically or financially when they're asking for donations for certain things. How I, as a person or through the Enrich Project, can support that rather than spending so much time as I did in 2014, visiting different government departments, which is what I did. I held so many meetings at the end of 2014, speaking to different people and realizing that they certainly were not ready to address this issue. And I mean, they certainly admitted that they needed to be more transparent with communities, but when I asked them whether or not they were willing to consult with communities and go down to the communities, they kept saying to me, we don't have the resources. And I asked them, what does that mean? What resources do you need? Could you clarify? And they couldn't. And then one person mentioned something, and I realized this is what it's about. There's a fear of going to communities because we were screamed at when we went to one consultation. They screamed at us, and they don't understand that there are certain things that we cannot do. So I think there's a fear of the community voice, and I really think that's central to the issue. So yeah, I think I have to call my research assistant and say to him, you were right.
I'm going to just give you a chance on this one. So, Confessions of a Public Policy Prof. I mentioned to you that I came down earlier to sort of go through the questions with everybody, and we discussed this question and who is the best person to answer this question. And we realized actually everybody on the panel would have a really good answer on this question or some thoughts. So I would like to actually just pause on my list for a second and gather up the thoughts. So I'm just going to throw it back to the questioner one more time just to remind us what the question is, and then we'll go to the other two panelists and see what their thoughts are on that question.
Okay, so the question is, in order to demand their rights and preserve the little rights they have, should Indigenous groups be trying to engage with the settler government institutions and courts that have historically discriminated against them and oppressed them, or should they turn away from that and engage in more traditional forms of resistance like protest, blockades, and civil disobedience?
My answer to that is that I, as an Olno, am a treaty nation. We are a treaty nation. Treaty nation requires engagement with the Crown. We wouldn't have treaties if we didn't. We cannot implement our treaties unless we engage. That being said, the treaty relationship has to be effective. It has to be based on a well-established and good working relationship, and it has to be in recognition of our history and getting overcoming legacies like people screaming and understanding where that hate and where that anger comes from. So I think that as contemporary Mi'kmaq people, Ulnuq people, we have a wide array of tools that we can utilize in order to keep pressing the Crown to get that nation-to-nation relationship that we need in order to be effective treaty partners. Part of that is going to include protests, part of that is going to include the legal route, but regardless of what happens, even when we have successful recognition of our rights, regardless if we have successful recognition of our protests and realize that this is a priority that the Crown needs to focus on, it always comes back to working with the government. And we have to maintain that value as Ulnuq, otherwise we are ourselves giving up on our treaty relationship.
John Paul?
Well, I guess the big point is that the treaty relationship is a foundational piece, and these processes that are being set up over decades and centuries didn't exist in the past. And you know, I think that over the last couple cycles with the last bunch that were there, they just had everything on ignore, basically, and, you know, do anything and ignore everything. And I think that the government is trying to listen, but I always tell people, I said, well, you can listen, but you have to do something. You have to engage, and you have to talk to people in a good way to produce a good outcome. And you know, we had somebody talking about all the changes to the legislation on fisheries, environment, and all these processes. And you know, a point that keeps coming up is the only way any project is going to improve or get better or be mitigated to our interest is by our involvement. And by whatever means it is, by protest, by whatever means it is, but I actually believe that it could make a better project in the end. Whatever the project is, it doesn't matter. And then allowing that allow the flexibility for the government or the proponent to do a process like you mentioned, a separate process that incorporates those values and encompasses those approaches and those level of engagement in a way that it's not perceived as a checklist versus you're actually going to take this, what you're being told, to actually do something with it, which is fundamentally different than the way the environmental processes work today. And I do understand the difference, and I think it's a difficult one for governments to get their head around, really. And you know, and I keep plugging away with it. We have a lot of environmental people that are from across the country trying to figure this out. But I think that as our capacity grows in this area and in this particular area, I think that more innovative approaches will emerge. And they're already coming about now, but I really believe that more innovative approaches will come out. And my friends in British Columbia were involved with the other pipeline, the big gas pipeline that was going to the Skeena River. And basically, it was crazy because they actually got a scientist, did a study, studied the river, studied the salmon, and surmised that it would have no impact when it was the spawning grounds for the salmon on the Skeena River. I said, like, who would actually believe that? And it was some scientist that they bought and paid for to do it and present those findings. And you know, we need our own capacity, we need our own approach, and we need our own ability to do this kind of thing for the best interest of our people in the end. Because like you said, you've been here 10, 15,000 years. I tell people there's still going to be Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, News. They're still going to be floating around 10,000 years time in the future. So get used to us, you know. And I think like the environment is always an important part to our people, because many of our people believe doing harm to the environment and to the world is you're doing harm. They see it as a bad thing because they believe the river and the nature and the water is a living something. And when you believe that at the molecular atomic level, it does give you a different mindset. It does give you a different approach. And I think that as more of our expertise emerges in the next while, I think that will be applied more and more on these different projects that are going on in the country. And you know, I just hope that that is something that both governments and proponents of projects, because it's not just the government, the proponents are there too, and both need to get it through their head that you know, if you want to ensure that this place that we call Nova Scotia or Canada or Earth is going to be here another 100, 200 years. Well, you got to start thinking about this stuff. You know, and I actually believe that because of all the things I've learned from Albert Marshall and other teachers that talk about the connectedness to the environment and the other realities that exist, that the scientific approach is an approach. That's what it is. And this other one, this other eye seeing or the two eye seeing approach really helps you give a better perspective in terms of incorporating your culture, language, and your beliefs, but trying to figure it out in the best way forward, basically. And I know that more and more of our people are involved in that, and I think they're slowly building a body of expertise that I think that both proponents and governments are just going to have to listen rather than just ignoring them.
Please remember John Paul's comments next week when we're talking about should science drive policy. I think everybody had an idea what the answer to that question was until you've just commented and give us a new perspective, an interesting perspective on that. So thank you. And now we're going to go to William for his question.
My name is William, and I'm also a first-year MPA candidate here at Dal. My question is for John Paul, along this theme of self-determination. Do you believe that the organizational design of First Nation Crown relations as a federal and provincial system is partly at fault for the slow process of reconciliation? And if so, what alternative, if any, would you suggest?
Well, I think it's hard to change something that's built on such legal foundations and cultural foundations and policy foundations of decades or centuries, basically. Very difficult structure and process to change. And it's kind of funny because I did talk to a couple of those ministers that were on the cabinet committee that dealt with laws, policies, and dealing with operational practices. And one of the things I told the person was, I said, show us something that will be a success all the way through. Otherwise, it's very difficult to believe you, right? It's very difficult to believe you when you've had a couple hundred years of legislation that was never created in our interest. You have a whole 2 government departments now that I call them the 8,000 people supposed to help us back home, and I don't know. And plus government is so big, and you know, I think the reconciliation, there's a part to reconciliation that's always got to be remembered. It's truth. The commission was called Truth and Reconciliation. So the government's got to get with the truth to actually honestly do things with us rather than do things and then get our input and then do whatever they do. And I think it'll build a better future for everybody, because the number one question I ask people in the government that I talk to, ministers and others, have you read the report? Have you read all the calls to action in full? Because I tell them, your 3 reading materials are UNDRIP, the TRC calls to action, and understand who we are. You know, like RCAP was a big report that was written years and years ago. And the federal government decided only to pursue 42 of the recommendations. So, you know, you look at that, there's like 440 recommendations that were in that report. So there's like quite a few that nobody did anything about. And I think defining self-determination has to involve our people and has to involve our communities and them figuring out what the future is going to be. Governments external to us can't tell us. They can't. They can suggest things, but they can't tell us. And communities And the inclusion and involvement of communities in figuring that out is essential to make something work in the modern world. Like, maybe some of the things that we had 200 years ago won't work today, but maybe there are some principles and values that could be incorporated into a system of government that gives us that legitimacy and recognition as we all say. And we all say we're all treaty people because there are always two players involved in the game. And in Canada, the big players are always the federal government and the province. And, you know, I think that, you know, we'll have to wait and see over the next year or two, because my warning was always telling people the last 3 years, I said things could revert back to what it was. I said, and everything just goes in cement and everything's on hold. I said it could go back that way. So we have to be resilient to that and really think it through to garner the support of our communities and our people and all our leaders, traditional leaders and our elected leaders together to figure it out. Because I always tell everybody, I don't have the answers, guys. We're all going to have to figure this out. I'm going to have treaty rights. My kids are going to have treaty rights. They're going to, you know, they're going to have this. So we have to figure it out to explain that clearly to government, not in the government kind of construct that they keep putting us in.
Okay, I'd like to open it up to the floor.
Can I actually answer that question though, too?
Sure.
Sorry.
If we
Oh,
just
no.
keep it short?
Okay.
No, just because I want to get to floor questions as well, but go ahead, please.
I was just going to say that I think that as Canadians, we love to argue over provincial and federal jurisdiction, and we get bogged down in that. But I think in terms of resolving, like, the treaty relationship, it's actually more the underlying Crown title that's proving more problematic. Because if you look at what happened in the States, the transferring was much easier accomplished, and I think that's probably more what the crux of the problem is.
Okay, there's a hand up. Yes, please go ahead.
I can work with that microphone.
No, it's online. It's the whole world.
It's got to go online, you know.
It's being
It's got to be on
overwhelmed.
Facebook and all the other things.
Hello, my name is Karen McKendry. I work at the Ecology Action Center on wilderness issues. Thank you for this talk today. It's been really interesting. You've touched on some pieces of legislation at the federal level and I'm assuming provincial level that are not working, in part because they weren't co-created with an Indigenous worldview and values incorporated into them. Can you think of pieces of legislation that are valid within all governments that contributed to them that are working well, or processes that you are excited about because they incorporate the things that you think really need to be there?
Well, I think that the thing I keep saying is that they're actually trying, but it's like I believe until they actually operationalize some of these things with the new legislation that was just amended and included all these new different things, I think they're going to have to go through a couple test runs to actually figure out how to be more inclusive of us with those processes. And it may take a little time to do that because I don't even know if that's, I think it's law, and the regulatory stuff is just getting done for a lot of the things with fisheries and the Environmental Assessment Act and some of the other ones. So my thinking is until they run it through a couple times with some major project. There's a big major project going on in BC right now, so it'll be interesting to see how and what comes out of it, because unless they incorporate those things, you're trying to make the process better. You know what I mean? Like that's our view. We're trying to make the process better, so there'll be a better Canada for everybody, not just us. So unless you incorporate these different things in the process, it's very difficult to get your point in after the fact. And the sooner you're in discussions with proponents of whatever it is, you know, talking and dealing with our Indigenous folks back home, I think it'll go a long way, because I'll just tell you this brief story about when oil and gas came to Nova Scotia. This was a long time ago, maybe 30 years ago. Well, it was funny because I was at a meeting one day with ExxonMobil and a bunch of everybody there, and Guy came from Texas, some guy, lawyer from Texas came in. He just told the government, you guys are gonna do that, you guys are gonna do that, and you guys are gonna do that. Or we're not doing the whole project. And this was like billions of dollars on the line. So he says, if I go back and it's a no, we ain't doing the project. So they all, most everybody caved except the indigenous people that were in the meeting, and they went ahead with the project anyway. That was Scotia Offshore Gas Project off Sable Island. So going around this process always keeps telling me you gotta improve the process every time.
Ingrid, go ahead.
I just think we have to be honest. There's no respect for Indigenous peoples. That's what all this is about. And we could try to get at it in different ways. It's about racism and absolutely no respect for Indigenous peoples. All the things we talk about have to be premised on respect for Indigenous peoples, allowing Indigenous peoples to set the tone for issues that impact their lives, and having an existing relationship with Indigenous peoples that is respectful of Indigenous peoples, and that's not happening. So some of the things we're talking about with respect to policy, is there already a relationship that you've built with Indigenous peoples? Because if you already built respectful, authentic, organic relationships with Indigenous peoples, then many of the things we're talking about would be possible. But underlying all of this is racism, if we have to be honest, and a lack of respect for the well-being of Indigenous people, Black people, and other people who are impacted by industry and other issues in this province. So I think we can go around in circles, but this is what it's all about. So I don't know how if you view Indigenous peoples as inherently inferior and their cultures as inferior, then what flows from that is all the things that we're talking about, not allowing them certain rights regardless of the issue. So I don't know how we get past that. When you have a government, a politician who I found certain politicians who are cheerleaders for my project, who I think really are authentic and want to do the right thing. And in terms of my interactions with government, although I've kind of, as I said, I'm putting most of my hat in terms of community mobilizing and what I think Indigenous people can do around the environment, there are certain cheerleaders who have been extremely supportive of my project. And those are the people that I want to focus on in terms of what we could build together. That also requires Indigenous involvement. But until there's a real respect for Indigenous peoples and a view that doesn't see them as inferior culturally, intellectually, then these issues will be very, very difficult. Because we have to look at what the government looks like, who's in power.
Cheryl?
I actually like some of the work. It's not necessarily resulting in legislation, but I like some of the work that's going around access and harvesting with parks. But I think that the perspective and the interests at stake tend to be a little bit different than you have when you're talking generally within Crown land. But I like that there is more of a dialogue. There's more an acceptance of Indigenous science that's being incorporated, and I hope that will translate into legislation. But on the ground, the effects seem to be shifting, and that's good. It's given us an opportunity to be demonstrative in terms of how we harvested, what our sustainability, like our stewardship principles are, how they play out, how the governance is related to it, which laws are needed. So I have seen movement in terms of a working relationship with that. There's still some flaws, but I like where it's going. And I think that in terms of like in a non-environmental issues, there's some work that's being done with the child welfare legislations that's being developed out west. Again, they have their issues and there's some flaws and whatnot, but I like how some governments are starting to move these issues forward to address real life problems. So I will give credit where credit is due. It's a shame that I'm only coming up with 2 examples, but but there is good work that's being accomplished.
Hi, my name is Jean-Luc. Really great panel, really great discussion. I just wanted to open up a question. I like the voice of optimism that Paul and Simon have toward maybe the current Liberal government and the community effort to be less racist. And maybe that's an ideal and it's too idealistic, and there's a realist perspective that says it's just not happening, and that's a fear. And I think that a great thing that I've learned from this panel is that the movement has to be toward empowering Indigenous communities and to give them the ability to do their own research and to make their own voice heard. And I think a lot of that has to be. So my question is, John Paul, earlier you said that the voices of Indigenous communities move at a slower rate than the voices of the political government. And of course that's a problem with making this a reality, that you could have an Indigenous government within the Canadian context that's able to have a voice of its own. But do you have a fear, like you said, we could recess, we could go back, we could move backward, we could become more racist and more closed off? Do you have a fear that if we don't act quickly, if these voices don't coalesce to some sort of cooperation, that we could end up with a new government that is not making progress on these issues, and that the voice, if we don't act on it now, with the window of 2019, we might miss the opportunity, even if there's, obviously, if we don't make good enough, even if the government doesn't listen openly enough and doesn't make compromises openly enough, then maybe they'll make bad decisions.
They have the time to make the choice.
Yeah.
The legislation has not been tabled in the House of Commons yet. So I always give them the benefit of the doubt and say, okay, well, listen to what people are saying. Why is it so urgent? And I recognize that that they're at the end, near the end of their mandate, but I would say, like, why not try to get it as right as you can, rather than rush it and then have to work to try to undo element of it later on? Because what I mentioned about the policy that exists is linked to this legislation directly. It's not stated anywhere in any of the material you read, anywhere. But I can see a direct connection between this policy framework that's existed for, like I said, 18 years at least, is connected to what they're talking about. And I think the minister believes that the policy is good, because it was a Liberal government that created the policy years and years ago. I said, yeah, maybe it was at the time, but I think you have to pay heed to what the Indigenous people are saying and take it to heart, because how many times do we have to make a mistake to do it right? That's how I look at it. And sometimes they rush things for whatever reason, but you miss stuff. And when you miss stuff, it has other consequences that are virtually unintended. And I think that if they're truly to their word about co-development, they should stick to that. Because there are legal scholars in the Indigenous country that can actually provide the words that will make sense. And then do the process of getting input and buying and educating people about what it is, because it's like they like going fast on stuff, and the stuff you want to go fast on is like climbing Mount Everest.
We're almost at the end. I'm going to ask a question of Ingrid, if I may, before we close off. You mentioned in your book that we need to see stronger partnerships between African Nova Scotian community and the Indigenous community for either moral or strategic reasons. And I wonder if you might just take a moment to elaborate on that concept for us and why that's so important. And what constrains it, I guess. What constrains it?
Yeah. Both communities are dealing with similar issues. Poverty and income insecurity and food insecurity and housing issues and undereducation and environmental racism. And what I've seen over the years, and I understand it, but is that these communities are not coming together on the issue, particularly of environmental racism. I held a conference in 2014 which brought together both communities after after doing workshops in the community separately, and I brought them together, and Indigenous people were really surprised that African Nova Scotians were dealing with environmental racism. Vice versa, African Nova Scotians were surprised. So obviously there's never really been a forum where they came together. And while I recognize that the histories and experiences and cultures and priorities of Indigenous and Black communities are different, I think building solidarities between both communities can be extremely powerful. It's something that has been challenging. Once again, I can be a very naive person, so when I came from Toronto to Halifax, I said, oh, I'm going to see if I can bring these communities together. Once again, naive. And over the past few years, I see how difficult that is, and I understand it once again. I understand the histories are different, the priorities are different. And they're incorporated into legislation and government policy in very different ways. But when I have brought these communities together through public engagement events and workshops, I see how powerful it could potentially be. It's been a slow process, but when I do these public engagement events and I make sure that I have a balance of speakers from both communities, I see what transpires between community members from both communities. And I say to myself, what could happen if they really got together in terms of demanding particular issues on environmental racism together and not separately? I have to say that what I'm seeing with Indigenous communities are that they're more mobilized than African Nova Scotian communities. They're much more engaged in the issue of environmental racism. And that's something I respect so much when I think of the people that I know. The persistence, the diligence around addressing these issues. And then I look at the African Nova Scotian communities and I see that they've given up. There's a kind of different spirit. And I understand why they've given up. Lincolnville has had a landfill since 1974. Shelburne has had a landfill since the 1950s. It makes sense that they've given up. But I said, if they can get them together with Indigenous peoples who are so mobilized on this issue and voice their concerns often and frequently and are so persistent on this issue, I wonder what could happen. So once again, that's a great possibility. I understand, however, the different histories, the different priorities, the different traditions, the different ways of doing that makes it difficult. But once again, this is where I see possibilities. I see possibilities with government, but I'm seeing more possibilities with building solidarities across differences.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our panel for an outstanding discussion. It's been really very enlightening, and we've really crossed over a number of subjects, and I think it's been extremely stimulating for us. As is the custom, I will present you with some tokens of our appreciation after the roundtable down at the MacEachen Institute that we'll be heading to after lunch. In the meantime, please join me in thanking our panelists today.